Hi, I just wanted to talk to you for a little bit about addressing a hostile audience when you write, even though the same principles probably apply for speaking as well. So, in an ideal world, when we write, everyone would be on our side, everybody would agree with what we already believed, and that would make our jobs really easy. But the reality of the situation is pretty much anytime you write something or speak for that matter, there are always going to be people who don't necessarily agree with what you have to say. That can be a challenging situation, and it's especially challenging if you know that your audience strongly disagrees with what you believe. Sometimes that will, you won't know what your audience thinks, but sometimes it will be very clear. I kind of think about Governor DeWine right now, right? He's been addressing Ohioans not every day, but fairly often since COVID occurred. And I think about sort of what a tough job he has. There's a very strong and loud faction of people who are very against the idea of having to wear masks. And every time he speaks, he knows that he's not just speaking to people who are accepting of having to wear a mask. He also has to try to convince people who are adamantly against that idea to wear masks as well. As we know, he has not been successful completely in that. He has sort of had to place these restrictions and make mandates in order for people to sort of adhere to these guidelines. But again, you have to think about what a tough job he has when he knows that so many people disagree with what he's trying to convince them to do. So when you write, it kind of depends on how willing the audience is to be open to understanding your position. Sometimes, if you have an audience that's open and truly wants to have a healthy debate and try to understand your position, you might be able to change someone's mind if you're persuasive enough. Sometimes the best you can do is just get that audience to acknowledge that you have a point, that your position is valid, but ultimately they still disagree with you or think that their view is stronger, right? What doesn't help is that we have a lot of bad examples of how to argue in our culture. A lot of them, come from politicians who don't necessarily argue in a fair way, who emphasize personal attacks, sometimes outright make stuff up to try to trash the opponent, right? And when you write, that's not the best way to argue. An argument doesn't have to be aggressive, doesn't have to attack someone's character. And I think any sort of college class is going to teach you that those are not effective or successful ways to make an argument, right? So again, we have all that stuff in our minds, and that impacts sort of how we understand what arguing is. Again, we have a lot in social media going on where people express their views, and if someone disagrees with them, then suddenly they jump to the conclusion, oh, that's a bad person. If they don't agree with my values, then they're bad, and I can treat them as badly as I want to, right? I can troll them, whatever. We have this idea of cancel culture today where we say we're just done with this person, right? Sometimes maybe that is valid, sometimes it's not, right? But the point is that as a writer, probably the most important person or audience member to have in mind is actually that hostile reader or hostile audience, because that's the person that it's going to be hardest to convince, right? When you imagine who your audience is for your papers, think of it as a mixed audience, right? There are going to be some people who probably agree with you, some people who are on the fence, and then some people who slightly or very strongly disagree with the position that you're going to argue, right? it's, if you had to kind of picture what that hostile audience member would look like, imagine the person sitting in the back with their arms folded, kind of smirking as you're trying to present your argument, right? That's the guy or girl that you need to try to address your argument to. Obviously, it's, the people who already agree with you, you don't have to work very hard to get their approval, right? But it's that hostile reader who always kind of needs to be in the back of your mind. So, above this video, you should have seen an explanation of what a Rogerian argument is. And while that type of argument is good for certain situations, I want to make clear that your upcoming essay number 4 should not be a Rogerian argument. You're not trying to, kind of completely come to a compromise on your position. And your essay should not be organized the way that a Rogerian argument does. I think that unless you are specifically told, write this as a Rogerian argument, your assumption should be that you're writing a more traditional argument with the organization that was discussed earlier in the learning activity. My guess would be if you had to write a Rogerian argument, it might be for a psychology course because, this guy, Carl Rogers, who came up with this method of argument, he himself was a psychologist. So, again, it's not a bad way to argue. It's actually really good. It's just not what I'm asking you to do for this upcoming essay. That being said, there are elements of Rogerian argument, again, this is right above this video, that you potentially could include in this essay number 4 that you're going to start working on. It's things like acknowledging where you have common ground with your opponent. It's things like expressing your opponent's positions in a neutral way rather than trashing them, attacking them right off the bat. Because, again, that's not something that is convincing to an audience. It comes off as more petty. So, again, the parts of a Rogerian argument that are really essential are treating your opponent respectfully and fairly. And that's something you absolutely should do in this essay number 4. So, I just took a sample topic here. And, what I did in this document is something you might do when you're in the generating ideas stage before you actually start drafting the essay. I always think it's good to take a topic and first pose it as a question that you have to answer, because that sort of forces you to think through it more than just automatically taking a position. So let's say I have the question or potential topic, should employers be allowed to fire employees for things they post on social media? We've seen really recently a lot of people getting consequences for stuff that they posted on social media, things related to racism, potentially offensive things, and they're getting punished for it. So again, this is kind of like an offshoot or a more specific question based on that thing we're seeing. So, you may not know what your position is on your topic right off the bat. If you don't, what you might do is just sort of 2 lists, sort of like pros and cons for each position, reasons why a certain position is good, and that should help you figure out where exactly you lie when it comes to the argument. So I think I could write a good essay taking either position on this question. And again, your test of whether it's a good question or not is, are there at least 2 arguable sides here? If you're not sure, that plotting out of like pros and cons or, looking at each view separately, that should help you tell, is there at least a couple of positions on this or not? If not, it's not a good topic for an argumentative essay. So I just picked one side. Like I said, I could have argued the other side as well, but let's say my position is yes. employers should have the right to fire employees for their posts on social media if they conflict with the values of the organization, as the employee is a representative of their organization and can damage them both financially and in terms of reputation. So again, let's say hypothetically, somebody posts some white supremacist or some, offensive thing on their Twitter account, right? Does that employer have the right to fire that person? I'm saying, let's say yes in this case, right? So, I think one of the most important things to do early on is try to understand, what would my opposing audience think about this, right? And I sort of phrased the question here as, what would my most hostile audience member, quote unquote, look like, right? What would the person who disagrees with me most, what would they think about this issue, right? So I just tried to sort of brainstorm what that might look like. So this person probably believes strongly in the notions of personal freedom and privacy. They probably believe that work life and personal life should inherently be separate, and that employers don't have the right to punish you for things that you do outside of work. They probably believe that what you've done or said in the past shouldn't follow you around forever, right? People make mistakes. Should that determine your fate forever? Probably not. They believe that people are capable of change and that one action does not determine a person's entire character, right? So this idea that just because somebody does a bad thing doesn't mean that that's who they are in life. People are more complicated than that. Again, they're probably against this idea of cancel culture, where you do something wrong and then you're shamed for it, and so socially we decide we're done with this person, right? Because they think that doing that eliminates the possibility for second chances or for growth. If you just say, oh, we're done with this person, that doesn't make them change their views, and it doesn't sort of rehabilitate how they act or treat other people, right? So maybe it's better if we kind of talk through things or take some other consequence, right? What I would also do early on here is figure out, where do these two sides agree? Because that's probably something I would mention in the paper, right? Both probably believe strongly in this idea of freedom, but they just see that freedom in different ways, right? So the freedom of organizations to fire employees for any conduct they consider wrong, versus those people who believe strongly in the freedom of speech and that citizens should be able to say what they want for the most part. Both agree that work and private life should be separate. Again, they just see how that works differently, right? So one side sees keeping your views private rather than public, i.e. don't post everything you believe on social media, versus the side that says work standards should not impact your private or non-work related actions. This idea that if it doesn't directly have to do with work, then you shouldn't be published in your or punished in your career for that, right? And then finally, both groups probably don't condone saying or doing offensive stuff, right? So even people who would say, no, you shouldn't be fired for saying something offensive on Twitter, it's not that they don't think that that was a bad idea or that this person might be a jerk. It's just that they think that the consequence of firing that person doesn't really relate to what they've done, right? So that the punishment doesn't fit the crime, essentially. So again, I put a sample paragraph here of how you might address this. And again, you can kind of replay the video and read it on your own, so you can look at it slowly. But essentially, I brought up this opposing view. And again, I explained it thoroughly to show that I understand their position. And, in the middle, I ultimately acknowledged that these opponents are correct in some way. I said these opponents are correct that freedom is essential, but I said, and that's why employers have the freedom to fire whoever they want who doesn't fit with their values, right? So again, it's about presenting that opposition in a fair way, but then following with that explanation of why you disagree.